Welcome back to the Reliably Intermittent podcast. Back again for Group Pod 2.0. We've got, me here again, Aaron Ware with Clemens Nelson and Associates. And this isn't the first time you've seen anybody in a while on a podcast. You've got Drew Esposito back here with me again. How you doing, Drew?
Doing well.
We've got Somany Pitch back with us again. How you doing, Somany?
Good.
And then Heidi Miller. How you doing?
I'm doing awesome. Thank you.
Super excited that we didn't scare him off after the first one we did last time. It's like, it's not too bad. I compared it to Heidi when we were talking about it the first time. It's like being on a roller coaster for the first time. You're terrified in line, you get buckled in, you go through it, and it's like, oh man, that was actually awesome. I want to do that again. So here we are.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't that bad. So
that not that bad. I'll take it.
It's a ringing endorsement.
Yeah, exactly.
Somewhere between a backhanded compliment and true positivity. So, all right. Now, I think what we want to do on the group pod today is kind of take a dive into this week in HR again, as we've done a few times. And this time, I think we're going to spin it a little bit on its head and do employers behaving badly. Ooh, HR firm talking about employers. No, it's a case ripped from the headlines where I'll let Drew dive into the dirty details. But the thing that drew our attention to it, that brought our attention to it was the headline: Iowa company has betting pool on employees testing positive for COVID. So
reasonable.
Yeah, let's let that sink in for just a minute. This company thought it was a good idea to take bets, odds, money, what have you, on the employees getting the coronavirus. Just sheer brilliance.
Crazy.
And for the record, that's why we're saying an employer was behaving badly, at least as alleged. I need to say alleged right now because it's a complaint. Nothing's been proven. We're not going to name this company for obvious reasons, but let's just say hypothetically that this is true. Before we kick this around in conversational form, I'll just say for the group in the room, don't do that, dum-dums. Don't bet on your employees getting a potentially fatal disease. Seems like it should be said. There shouldn't have to be said, but apparently it does.
But Aaron, we can do March Madness. Why can't we bet on COVID deaths?
Yeah, that's
It's just
definitely
a different version of a knockout round, right? Like,
right.
What idiots.
Yeah. I think that logic would have failed on the SAT analogies portion.
Yeah, it's insane.
So Drew, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the more the finer points? Obviously, the stuff you get drawn in with the wacky headline, but there's obviously more to it.
Yep. So they grab the headline, and then I pulled up the complaint and went through it, and there was like one or two paragraphs that was a couple of the supervisors and high-level people had started this betting pool out of several hundred paragraphs of a complaint. Right.
And let's just make sure we clear that, say that clearly. This was supervisors and management.
Oh, and high level too. They're naming like chief executive officers. They're naming really high level people.
Yeah.
In the complaint.
Just another layer of dum-dum.
Yeah. And while complaints are wonderfully boring in the legal world, it had some really good like nuggets for all employers to think about. Especially if you're an employer in a state that has immunity from workers' compensation, that has like a NoFault system, like Ohio, where basically if you're injured on the job, the employee gets it. And the employer is immune from tort liability, from strict liability, unless you can prove this really heightened standard. And that exists in a lot of places. So you know it if you have it and if you don't. And when you get into this complaint, it appears they're trying to get this tort liability in a workers' comp state. And what they're alleging is fraudulent misrepresentation, gross negligence, and punitive damages and things like that, because they failed to implement policies and procedures to keep the safety of the workforce. So that would be like if you work in a place that is stamping license plates right down the line, and there's a safety guard on it that makes you only do 100 plates per hour, and your employer says, I need 200 plates, but the only way you can do that is you take that safety guard off, and they instruct you to take it off, or they know you took it off, and then you get your hand chopped off. Like, that's gross negligence, and you likely have an intentional tort and can probably pierce this workers' comp system. So this facility had multiple locations, and one of their locations had a massive outbreak, and they willfully transferred the group of employees from the one facility to the clean facility. And they made a lot of promises, like they were going to test the employees, they were supposed to quarantine them, that they would notify people if they came into contact. They made all these representations to the employees, and they're alleging that none of that actually happened. It was fraudulent representation. And then a lot of people caught it in the second facility, and also a lot of people died, right? So you're talking about wrongful death, and you're talking about all that stuff that goes along. It's tragedy, and it's kind of rolled into this whole thing of governmental programs and regulations relating to COVID, right? Relating to quarantining, relating to spacing, relating to shutdowns, because they're alleging a lot of safety stuff. So people aren't 6 feet apart, people aren't wearing masks, people are crowded together, probably things that we're advising our clients on. This place was violating them, and they're saying the supervisors knew about it and willfully were telling people to not follow it. So that's where they're trying to get these big damages. So it's not as exciting as the gambling pool, but when you start reading it, you go, oh, crud, right? Even if I'm in a state that has this liability protection, could I get drawn into a lawsuit, or could I be a headline? Even if this employer doesn't have liability, because maybe when the facts come out, they did do everything. Well, us here in Ohio, which is not where this place was, us four have read about it. We know the company, and now your name is dragged through the mud.
Well,
So-
it's kind of a variation on the common theme on this stuff when we do This Week in HR, right? These things come to our attention because they made headlines. And like we talked about when we did the very first podcast or the second podcast, where our employees are building a man cave under the subway, and the MTA had months and months and months of advance notice, didn't do anything about it, and then only really took action once it was essentially rediscovered and made headlines. Like there's oftentimes steps you can take way in advance to avoid making headlines.
Yep. And so when I read it, the question that came to mind for me that I wanted to pose to you three is, when you're dealing as HR professionals with a variety of clients across a variety of walks of life, across a variety of political spectrums, right? So this isn't to say one way or another, like this is not our position to take on whether you support your local officials' mask mandates, whether you think it's an infringement on your freedoms, whether you believe in the seriousness of COVID or don't believe in it, whether you have a personal experience of a death or not, or you got it and we're asymptomatic and we're in the clear. That's really not the issue. It's, what do you do when you're advising clients that have these competing opinions, and say, how do you advise them the importance of following rules regardless of whether you believe in them, I guess, and not get political and not get personal about it.
Yeah, I mean, because we run into that quite a bit. I think it helps to have some education too on our side when we go into it. Here's what the rules are. Here's what they actually say.
I don't know. What would you guys do?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, well, first of all, kind of building from that, I think, at least for me, something that I never saw when COVID started was the fact that it was going to get so personal. It did get very political, and those things I never saw coming. So it has become a big issue for employers on how to deal with these different beliefs. And I think it was said best that when trying to look at this, well, one, it's going to work from the top down. And then the other thing is, when you're looking at these rules and these guidelines, you really got to take COVID out of it. You have to look at it as, there's this rule in place, and like any other rule that you would have in the workplace, what's that expectation? Well, if an employee breaks the rule, they get disciplined. If the employer is the one breaking the rule, what happens then? Well, they could end up in court. So you don't have to agree. Your employees don't have to agree, but they also don't have to agree with your typical rules that are non-COVID related, but they still have to follow them. And that's kind of the stance that we've taken with our clients, and the feedback that we would give and the recommendation on how to handle that.
Kind of like, why would you treat it differently?
Exactly.
Like I think I had a client implement a rule on like tattoos,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's like, yeah, did you implement a rule because you knew all of your employees would agree with it, or because it's what you wanted, right?
Exactly.
And then you expect them to follow it.
Yeah. It seems pretty simple when it's put like that. So
Yeah.
I think Somany, you had something there.
Yeah, and then just to be practical, they've just, for instance, with this case, they've turned a problem into an even bigger problem. So it could have been manageable. They closed down one of the locations, and then they could have just taken all the steps and made sure that it was a small problem and it stayed a small problem, and now they've got this huge problem. But yeah, just be practical and be smart
Sure.
in your decisions.
I think that hits too, like the practicality standpoint. Not that I'm an overly sensitive or emotional person, but like to bring it back to like personal stuff that I hear a lot from people that have had personal tragedies in their life or faced adversity. The universal thing that I hear a lot is they want to be comfortable saying that I did whatever I could. And then if an adverse thing happens, whether it's a death, whatever the tragedy is, then for certain it's not your fault, right? So I've used this example. I was talking to a client that had an employee die as a result of COVID. And I compared this to my wife and I's first child, who was a preemie, and my wife was sanitizing everything under the sun. Every bottle after everything, because of the immune system compromised. There's no pools and daycare and things like that for a period of time. And we had to do that for a year. So I personally very fatigued. Like, we're making so much work. There's so many bottle parts to these Dr. Brown's bottles. I'm so frustrated. Like, you're making a 5-minute task into an hour-long task. We've been doing this for 6 months. We're good. And she just simply goes, you know what? You're probably right. Like, I'm probably being crazy. This is probably overkill. But if my kid gets sick and doesn't recover, I don't want the doubt in my mind. And I also think that goes with what Heidi said from the rule making and what Somany said with the practicality. When you combine them, you as an employer, whether you believe, don't believe, whatever, don't you just want to know? That outbreak may have been unavoidable at this employer, but don't you just want to know it wasn't because of your negligence or your desire to have your belief known? Like, I'm going to I want everybody to know I don't believe in the efficacy of masks. So I'm not going to wear one myself, and I'm the boss, and therefore my employees don't wear them. And then someone gets sick. They may have got it outside your workplace, but don't you want to know it didn't happen from you? Just selfish peace of mind,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's definitely an element of, self-interest.
yeah.
We use it quite often in some of the things that we do with our clients in negotiations and things. You can use someone's self-interest to get to a common aim or to get to a good outcome. You can kind of use people's emotions here, or you can use people's interest or whatever it is that they're trying to achieve in order to get to where everybody needs to go. And here, like you said, it's real basic stuff. You want to set the precedent as the head honcho in this case. You can say what you want to say, but ultimately there's a self-interestedness that almost every CEO is going to have to make sure that the business stays running, like Somany was saying, the practical side of it, right? I don't believe X, Y, or Z. Yeah, but I also believe that we need to turn a profit. We need to stay open. So on the chance that these guidelines, like Heidi was talking about, like all of those things are true in the back of my mind, or they're not, I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
I want to keep making money. I want to stay open. So I know these people are sick. We should segregate them. We should quarantine them from the general workforce over here, so I don't turn problem in this area into a problem in the whole area. And we're no longer going to be making money. We're no longer going to be able to function.
Yeah.
Use
no
that.
longer be able to service our taxpayers, service our clientele.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing I didn't understand with like the bars and restaurants, at least when I'd read these articles where people would operate at like 100% capacity, and like then they would get reported and people would take pictures of them, and it's like they were authorized to operate at 50. And look, I'm not in the bar and restaurant industry, so that may have been a choice of paying your mortgage. So like it's tough for me to cast a judgment on someone, but I go, wouldn't you rather be operating at 50% capacity for 5 months than operate at 100% capacity for 3 days, have the health department come in and then yank your liquor license and shut you down, right? Like 50% may not be enough to stay open, but I can guarantee you staying open for 2 days to prove a point and then getting it all shut down didn't do good for you or any of your employees. I mean,
Well, and something else I think of too, I mean, employers are kind of always saying leave personal at home, personal stays at home, work is work. And it's kind of another way to look at it is your personal beliefs should honestly stay at home, assuming that nothing dangerous or safety concern, anything like that is going on. But I guess that's another way to look at it too.
I think it's a great point. I think it's, I think I've used this phrase a lot of different times. It's not personal, it's personnel.
Correct.
We've all got a job to do. So we need to be able to come in and do the job and put aside what we need to put aside. And if your personal beliefs are such that you can't put it aside, then maybe you need to look for another line of work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't want to be callous. I don't want to be whatever, but I mean, it's just the practical reality of what we all face. If you're in a line of work that you can't put that personal stuff aside, then maybe you need to consider another line of work.
Yeah.
I think that's fair.
I think to bring it back a lot, like all around to the very first headline is, and it's been said, I think by all four of us too, is this is one where like the employer has to set the example.
Yes.
Right? Like if you're telling your employees, don't bring your personnel, your personal issues, don't bring your views on this person dating this person or this religion or that religion or this politician or that politician. And then you yourself as the boss go, well, I know there's a statewide law on this, but that's just crazy and I don't believe it and yada, yada, yada. So none of you have to follow it because I'm not going to follow it. Like you got to lead by example.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you got to do what you don't want to do.
Yep.
Right? That just is what it is. If it's a lawfully implemented rule, whether it's from you to your employees or from your governing body that has some sort of control over you as an employer, whether it's public or private, you got to follow it. There's just no ifs or ands, about it.
I think we can all agree that we don't need a rule to say, don't bet on your employees dying.
Correct.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty simple.
I just want to put a bow on that.
I'm waffling on that one.
I can't stress enough. That's probably at a minimum poor judgment.
Correct.
Yeah, there's nothing like trying to attract, future talent with, when if you Google the company's name and then like the first 5 hits come up with like, oh, I got to go work for a place where they bet if I'm going to die or not. Let me go work for that employer. Let me put in extra effort if I'm an existing employee. Let me put in that extra hour to work for them when they are betting if I'm going to die. Ugh.
Yeah.
It's so gross.
Not good.
So gross. But
well,
that's all I had for it on this one.
I think
we've anything else.
Somany, Heidi, anything?
I got nothing.
All right. Well, I want to thank Drinking Through a Straw Gang to coming back for another podcast. I'm still disappointed in Drew. So
I didn't bring my.
It is a stir straw.
Yeah, I told you.
It's just a stir straw. Get out of here.
I made it even better.
All right. So, Somany, Heidi, Drew, thank you for
Thank
joining.
you again.
Thank you.
And as always,
Stay
to
safe.
those of you listening, like, subscribe, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. We're listed on all those. We have the YouTube channel where you get to see all of us get gussied up and put on video just for your entertainment and, infotainment purposes. So thank you for joining us. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell everybody. And until next time, goodbye. We want to thank you again for joining us on the Reliably Intermittent podcast. Now it's time for a bit of a disclaimer. This podcast and all others on this feed are for informational purposes only and not legal advice. No attorney-client relationship is formed by listening to this podcast or any others on the feed. Should you require or want legal advice, we encourage you to reach out to an attorney or statutory legal counsel, as the case may be. Thanks again for joining us, and we will talk to you next time.